What do we really inherit when we inherit an object? A stone cut from the earth, a mask shaped by careful hands, a painting mass-produced and hung in an ordinary living room. On the surface, these things appear still, silent, finished, yet history has a way of clinging to matter, as if memory itself can settle into wood grain, silver, pigment, and dust. Across centuries and continents, people have told stories about objects that seem to carry more than beauty or value. They pass from temple to palace, from burial ground to museum vault, from family home to auction room. And wherever they go, something unsettled seems to follow. Illness, fire, ruin, nightmares that feel older than the dreamer. The modern mind resists these patterns, and perhaps it should. Coincidence can be powerful. Fear can be contagious. A story, once spoken aloud, can change the way a room feels. And yet, some stories do not fade when reason arrives. They deepen. This is not a journey into superstition for its own sake, nor a search for easy answers dressed as mystery. It is a quieter investigation than that, a human one. It asks why certain artifacts gather such gravity around them, why some objects seem to become vessels for grief, conquest, longing, or guilt. Maybe the question is not whether they are cursed in any literal sense. Maybe the question is why so many people, in so many different places, have felt that once an object is torn from its world, something invisible is torn as well. In the chapters ahead, we will follow 10 artifacts through wars, museums, estate sales, sacred landscapes, and private collections. Some are famous. Others survived only in whispers, letters, and uneasy recollections. Together, they form a kind of shadow archive, one that lives at the edge of science and story. Because sometimes the deepest mysteries are not about what an object does, they are about what it remembers. What if the most unsettling thing in a burned house was the one thing the fire refused to take? In the autumn of 1985, fire crews across northern England began walking through the same strange scene. Kitchens were blackened. Curtains had vanished into smoke. Ceilings sagged, wet with ash and heat. But somewhere on a wall or face down among the debris, a cheap print of a weeping child remained almost untouched. It was called the Crying Boy, not a priceless masterpiece, not an ancient icon, just a widely sold reproduction, bought by ordinary families and hung in living rooms, hallways, and modest brick homes. The child's eyes were glossy with sorrow, his face lit in that familiar way sentimental art often is, inviting pity without explanation. It should have been forgettable. Instead, it became unforgettable. As house fires multiplied, so did the whispers. Firefighters noticed the pattern first, or at least they were the ones who kept finding themselves staring at it. The image survived where wallpaper curled away, where furniture collapsed, where framed photographs of real children disappeared forever. Some said the print was simply treated with flame-resistant varnish. Others noted that falling cords might have flipped it face down, shielding it from the worst of the blaze. These explanations were reasonable. They may even have been true. But reason rarely arrives alone. It enters a room already crowded by grief. Soon the painting was blamed for more than survival. Families spoke of illness, arguments, job loss, sudden deaths, a slow gathering of misfortune that seemed to begin only after the picture was brought home. Tabloids amplified the fear. Shops stopped wanting returned copies. Charities refused donations. Eventually, in a gesture that felt half practical and half ritual, hundreds of prints were burned together in a public bonfire, as if a story could be ended by feeding it to the flames. Yet stories rarely burn as easily as paper, because what haunted people was not only the possibility of a curse, it was the image itself, a child already touched by sadness, continuing to look outward while everything around him disappeared. And maybe that is why the painting endured in memory, not because it proved the supernatural, but because it gave shape to a more intimate fear. That suffering might leave a mark, that sorrow might linger in ordinary things, and that sometimes what survives a fire is the very thing we can no longer explain. How does a sealed box become heavier than wood, nails, and what it holds inside? Long before the word went viral online, the idea of a Dybbuk box belonged to a much older landscape of belief. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is not an object at all, but a restless spirit, a presence said to cling to the living when something unresolved refuses to let go. The box came later, shaped not in scripture, but in the uneasy space where tradition, memory, and commerce sometimes blur. Its story surfaced in the modern world through a small cabinet, reportedly purchased at an estate sale and linked to an elderly woman who had survived the terrors of 20th century Europe. The details shifted depending on who told them. Some said she warned her family never to open it. Others said it held a strange inventory: old coins, locks of hair, a candlestick, a dried rosebud, things ordinary enough on their own, yet unsettling when gathered together in a hidden compartment. Once the box changed hands, the pattern of anecdotes began. Nightmares, sudden illness, the smell of jasmine or cat urine with no clear source, lights flickering, a pressure in the room that felt like being watched. Taken one by one, each event could be explained. Stress does strange things to the body. Old homes settle and groan. Suggestion is powerful, especially when a story arrives before sleep does. But objects are rarely judged one event at a time. They are judged by accumulation, by the feeling that separate incidents begin to arrange themselves into a shape. That is what made the box compelling, not proof, but pattern. Eventually, it moved through online auctions, private owners, paranormal television, and museum display, becoming less a household cabinet than a modern relic of dread. With every retelling, it gathered new layers, like dust becoming history. Some people saw a fraud, some saw folklore evolving in real time. Others saw something more intimate, the possibility that trauma itself can behave like a spirit, passed hand to hand, entering new rooms long after the original wound. And maybe that is the more difficult thought to sit with, because whether the box held anything supernatural may not be the deepest question. The deeper question is why human beings so often build containers for what they cannot bear. A chest, a shrine, a locked drawer, a story. We place fear inside and hope the boundary will hold. But some inheritances do not stay where we put them. Some memories do not remain buried because a lid has been closed. And sometimes the most haunted thing is not the object itself, but the sorrow we sense waiting inside it. Can a stone become a witness to everything that happened after it was taken in 1857, amid the violence and confusion of the Indian uprising against British rule? A British officer carried a violet gem out of a temple and into another world. It was not the largest treasure taken in that era, nor the most celebrated. Yet over time, this single stone gathered a reputation far heavier than its size. It would later be called the Delhi Purple Sapphire, though gem experts eventually identified it as an amethyst. The correction changed the mineral, not the mood. By the time it reached England, the story around it had already begun to darken. The officer who removed it reportedly fell into financial trouble and failing health. The gem then passed through other hands, and with each transfer came another chapter of decline. Business collapses, illness, accidents, private desperation written into letters rather than newspapers. One of its most famous custodians was Edward Heron Allen, a scholar and collector known for his skepticism. At first, he dismissed the warnings. Then he began trying repeatedly to get rid of it. But the stone kept returning, if not physically, then through consequence. Friends who accepted it sent it back after a run of misfortune. One woman who received it saw her career falter. Heron Allen eventually sealed the gem away, convinced it had become dangerous to his household, even to his child. He left strict instructions that it remain shut up for decades after his death, as if time itself might cool whatever clung to it. That gesture is what makes the story linger. Not the rumor of a curse, but the image of a rational man surrendering to caution. Today, the gem rests behind institutional care, cataloged, studied, and stripped of myth in the language of display. It is, scientifically speaking, unremarkable. A stone, a specimen, a colored crystal under controlled light, and yet its biography refuses to sound like geology. It sounds like remorse. Perhaps that is why the legend endures, because some objects seem to absorb the conditions of their removal. Not magic necessarily, something more historical and in some ways more unsettling. Conquest leaves marks. So does reverence. So does theft. And when an object crosses an ocean through violence, maybe what follows is not a supernatural punishment, but a longer echo of the moment it was taken. A stone cannot speak, but sometimes in the lives built around it, history finds another voice. What if a single pebble could carry the weight of a landscape that never agreed to be divided? In the red heart of Australia, Uluru rises from the desert with the stillness of something older than explanation. At sunrise, its surface blushes and deepens, as if the rock were not reflecting light, but holding it. For the Anangu people, this place is not a backdrop or landmark. It is alive with law, ancestry, and relationship. A sacred presence woven into story, ceremony, and the long continuity between land and human life. For decades, tourists arrived with cameras, hiking shoes, and the familiar impulse to take something home. Sometimes it was only a small fragment, a chip of sandstone slipped into a pocket like a harmless keepsake. But then the parcels began to return. They came by mail from around the world, small boxes, padded envelopes, stones wrapped in tissue, cloth, or apology letters written in hurried, uneasy handwriting. The stories inside were strikingly similar. A marriage collapsed, a business failed, a sudden illness appeared. One traveler described a chain of accidents that seemed to begin the moment the rock crossed an ocean. Another wrote simply that nothing had felt right since. Park staff gathered the fragments in restricted storage, where the collection grew year after year into a strange archive of regret. To skeptics, the explanation seemed straightforward. Guilt, suggestion, coincidence shaped into narrative. But to the Anangu, the issue was never really about curse or superstition. It was about breach, a sacred order disturbed, a relationship broken. That distinction matters, because modern culture often treats the world as material first and meaning second. A stone becomes a souvenir, a place becomes scenery, but certain landscapes resist that simplification. They ask to be encountered, not possessed. And perhaps that is why the returned fragments feel so moving. Not because they prove that the earth punishes us, but because they reveal how deeply people sense when they have crossed an invisible line. Somewhere beneath logic and habit, many still recognize that some places are not meant to be taken from. They are meant to be left whole. What happens when an object meant to guard the dead is placed under museum lights for the living? In a quiet storage wing, far from the polished galleries and school tours, there are objects that seem to change the temperature of a room. Wood darkens with age. Fibers hold the scent of earth and smoke. A carved face waits in silence. The Maori warrior mask belongs to that kind of silence, the kind that feels less empty than occupied. It was made in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in a world where carving was never merely decorative. This mask was tied to burial rites, to protection, to the sacred threshold between those who remained and those who had gone on. Its wood was shaped with intention, marked with red pigment, edged with materials that connected body, ancestry, and spirit. In its original setting, it had meaning because it belonged. Removed from that setting, it became something else. By the 19th century, like so many sacred objects swept into imperial collections, it had crossed an ocean and entered the archives of a foreign institution. There it was cataloged, stored, studied, and made legible in the language museums prefer. But some things resist becoming inventory. When curators later brought the mask out for examination and possible display, unease gathered around it. Illnesses were whispered about. 2 staff members associated with the project died within the same year. Others described headaches, dizziness, a smell of scorched timber where there was no fire, a feeling that the room had become suddenly crowded. None of this proved anything beyond coincidence. Yet coincidence, repeated often enough, begins to feel like a form of testimony. For Maori elders, the issue was never sensational. It was relational. The mask was tapu, sacred, restricted, bound to obligations the museum could not fulfill, simply by preserving temperature and humidity. To touch it without ceremony was not just disrespect, it was imbalance. And perhaps that is the deepest tension at the heart of this story. Modern institutions know how to conserve matter. They are less certain how to care for meaning. A mask can survive behind glass for centuries. But if it has been separated from the world that gave it voice, what exactly has been preserved? Sometimes an artifact does not become dangerous because it is powerful. Sometimes it becomes dangerous because we mistake possession for understanding. Can a chair remember the body of the man who died in it? In a museum devoted to crime, punishment, and the strange intimacy between violence and memory, there stands an ordinary-looking piece of furniture with an extraordinary reputation. Dark wood, heavy arms. The kind of chair one might ignore if it were not surrounded by warning, legend, and the accumulated hesitation of generations. It is known as Busby's Stoop chair, and for more than 2 centuries people have spoken of it not as a relic, but as a threat. The story begins in 18th century England with Thomas Busby, a man remembered as volatile, proud, and dangerous. He was eventually condemned and executed for murder. Before his death, according to legend, he cursed his favorite chair, declaring that anyone who sat in it thereafter would meet an untimely end. Stories like this often arrive polished by retelling, their edges smoothed into folklore, and yet this one persisted because it attached itself again and again to real lives. Over the years, the chair passed through inns, private hands, and public curiosity. Men sat in it as a joke, a challenge, or a drunken dismissal of superstition. Then accidents followed. Road collisions, falls, sudden illnesses. Soldiers on leave, laborers, travelers, even those who merely wished to prove a point were later said to have died soon after taking the seat. No single case could establish a pattern with certainty, but the number of stories became its own kind of evidence in the public imagination. Eventually, the chair was removed from ordinary use and placed in a museum, lifted high off the floor so that no visitor could sit in it again. It remains there today, suspended between artifact and warning, as if distance itself were part of its preservation. What gives the chair its force is not only the curse, but the intimacy of the object. A chair is made for trust. It invites the body to rest, to lower its guard, to occupy another person's place. In that sense, Busby's Stoop chair asks a more unsettling question than whether objects can be haunted. It asks whether violence can linger in the most domestic forms, whether rage can settle into wood the way smoke settles into cloth, and whether some stories endure because they give shape to an old human instinct. The feeling that where suffering happened, something remains. What if the most mysterious object in the room was not trying to frighten anyone at all, but simply to continue speaking? In a climate-controlled case, under the calm gaze of museum glass, lies a body that never expected to become an exhibit. The so-called unlucky mummy is not a full mummy in the dramatic style the name suggests, but the painted inner lid of an Egyptian coffin, the face of a woman rendered with quiet dignity and fixed, enduring eyes. Her features are elegant, almost serene. Yet for more than a century, this coffin lid has carried a reputation shadowed by misfortune. The tale began in the late 19th century when the artifact was reportedly acquired by a group of British travelers in Egypt. From the beginning, stories collected around it with remarkable speed. One man was said to have suffered injury after taking possession of it. Another met financial disaster. A photographer who attempted to capture its image spoke of fear and personal loss. Later accounts linked it, however loosely, to illness, accidents, even famous maritime catastrophe. The details changed from telling to telling, as such details often do. But the mood remained constant. Wherever the coffin lid went, something in its orbit seemed to go wrong. Scholars have long pointed out the weaknesses in the legend. Many stories cannot be verified. Some were almost certainly invented or embroidered by newspapers, eager for the Victorian public's fascination with Egypt, death, and the exotic unknown. This was the age of seances, spirit photography, imperial plunder, and drawing room ghost stories. The coffin lid entered not just a museum, but a cultural imagination already prepared to see ancient Egypt as both dazzling and dangerous. And still, the story endures, perhaps because the artifact confronts us with a difficult contradiction. We admire the craftsmanship, we praise preservation, we call it heritage, but the object itself belonged to a funerary world, one shaped by reverence, ritual, and the careful passage of a human life into death. Removed from that world, labeled and displayed, it became available to curiosity but separated from meaning. So maybe the real unease does not come from a curse at all. Maybe it comes from the way modern eyes look at the dead and call it collection. Maybe it comes from the uneasy feeling that not everything ancient was meant to be repurposed as spectacle. And maybe the woman painted on that coffin lid still unsettles us because, across all the years and all the glass between us, she seems less like an object than a presence, asking to be remembered differently. What if a jewel could become a mirror, reflecting not only light, but the appetite of every empire that tried to claim it? There are stones whose beauty seems almost innocent until you begin to trace the path they traveled. The Hope Diamond is one of them. Blue as deep water, blue as twilight gathering at the edge of a storm, it has spent centuries drawing the eye with that rare, impossible color. People call it magnificent, but magnificence is often just another word for something history has paid for dearly. Its story likely began in India, where a larger blue diamond was mined from the earth long before it entered European legend. From there, it moved through the hands of merchants, royalty, and collectors, cut and recut as power changed shape around it. Kings wore it, revolution overtook them, bankers possessed it, their fortunes turned, heiresses displayed it. Their lives became tangled in scandal, grief, or relentless public scrutiny. Over time, the diamond acquired a reputation that followed it from palace to private vault. Whoever owned it would eventually suffer. There are obvious problems with such a claim. Wealthy families are not immune to tragedy. Powerful people live in public, and public lives generate public myths. Once a stone is labeled cursed, every illness, accident, or failed marriage near it can be folded into the legend. The pattern can be built after the fact, polished like the gem itself. And yet the Hope Diamond remains compelling because its so-called curse expresses something deeper than superstition. It tells a moral history in the language of story. This diamond was not merely found. It was extracted, sold, transported, admired, insured, stolen in spirit if not always in law, and transformed into a symbol of prestige far from the world that first held it. Around such an object, misfortune can feel less like magic than consequence, drifting through generations. Today, the stone rests under museum protection, watched by visitors who lean toward the glass as though expecting to feel something emanate from within. Most feel only wonder. Some feel unease. Both responses make sense, because certain objects do not disturb us for what they might do. They disturb us for what they reveal about desire, how easily beauty becomes possession, how quickly possession becomes myth, and how often we call something cursed when what we are really seeing is the long afterlife of greed. What if a mirror was never meant to show us our own faces at all? In Japanese tradition, mirrors are not ordinary things. They do more than reflect. They witness. They stand at the threshold between appearance and essence, between what is offered and what is revealed. In shrines, polished surfaces have long held a sacred role, not because they decorate a space, but because they suggest that light itself can become a form of presence. To stand before such an object is not simply to look, it is to be looked back at. That is why the story of the temple mirror unsettles so many people. It begins in the late 20th century when a bronze mirror was reportedly removed from an aging Shinto temple before the site was dismantled. The object was beautiful in a restrained, ceremonial way, a smooth reflective face, an engraved reverse, symbols linked to divine ancestry and ritual order. The caretaker is said to have offered a warning. This mirror, he claimed, was not meant for private ownership. It belonged to a sacred context. Taken elsewhere, it would lose its balance. The warning was ignored, and soon the pattern began. The first owner, a businessman drawn to esoteric antiques, died suddenly not long after bringing it home. His sister later handled the mirror and, according to the story, was overcome by dizziness and visual disturbance before suffering a fatal collapse of her own. Then came a dealer tasked with transporting it for appraisal. He, too, died in an accident that made little sense to those who studied it. 3 people, 1 object, a sequence neat enough to become legend and tragic enough to resist easy dismissal. Of course, there are rational explanations. Sudden death is part of life's indifferent arithmetic. Stories spread quickly in close communities. Once an artifact acquires a reputation, every event near it becomes magnetized by meaning. But even skeptics sometimes pause at the symmetry of this tale, at the way each death seems to fold into an older understanding of what mirrors are for. Because in this tradition, a mirror is never only glass or metal. It is a moral surface, a spiritual instrument, a place where truth is not created but uncovered. Maybe that is why the object continues to trouble the imagination, not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it asks something uncomfortable of us. What happens when we take a sacred tool and turn it into decor? What disappears when reverence is replaced by possession? And what if the danger of certain objects lies in this simple mistake? That we think they exist to show us ourselves when they were made to reflect something greater? What if the dead do not ask for vengeance, only to be left where love first placed them? At the edge of old burial grounds, history often feels softer than in museums. Grass leans in the wind, names weather into stone. The earth settles, rises, settles again. Cemeteries remind us that memory was never meant to be permanent in the modern sense. It was meant to be tended, visited, spoken over. And yet in the 19th and early 20th centuries, graves across Europe and North America were routinely disturbed in the name of science, collecting, or curiosity. Coffins were opened, bones were removed, skulls changed hands as if the person they belonged to had become secondary to the object. Among the many stories born from that era is the legend of the stolen skull. Versions differ by country, by collector, by decade. In some tellings, it was taken from an old church crypt. In others, from a battlefield grave or a family mausoleum. But the pattern remains strikingly familiar. Someone acquires the skull as a curiosity, a conversation piece, a fragment of the past to place on a shelf. Soon afterward, unease begins to gather. Nightmares arrive. Doors open in the night. Illness enters the house. Servants resign. Family members describe a presence moving at the edge of their vision, less violent than insistent, as though something lost is trying to return. Skeptics would say these are the oldest ingredients of ghost story: guilt, suggestion, grief given a shape. And perhaps that is exactly right, but guilt itself is not trivial. It is one of the mind's most enduring ways of honoring a truth the body already knows. Because a human skull is not an artifact in the usual sense. It is a remainder of personhood. The face gone, the voice gone, the life unrepeatable. To turn that into decor is to cross a line many people feel instinctively, even when they cannot name it. In that sense, the haunting is almost beside the point. The real disturbance begins much earlier, in the act of removal. That may be why stories of stolen remains appear in so many cultures. They are less about supernatural punishment than about a moral order reasserting itself. They remind us that the dead are not raw material for fascination. They belong to relationships, to rituals, to the fragile dignity that survives even after breath does not. And maybe that is the quiet lesson buried beneath the legend, that some boundaries are not written in law, but in reverence. And that when we ignore them, what follows may feel like haunting, even if what we are really experiencing is the return of conscience. What if the most unsettling artifact was not ancient at all, but modern enough to look like us? There is something uniquely disquieting about a doll left alone in a room, not because it moves, but because it does not. It keeps the shape of childhood while refusing the softness of life. Painted eyes remain open. A stitched mouth suggests emotion without ever changing. In daylight, it can seem sentimental, almost harmless. At night, it becomes a question. The story of the haunted doll appears in many places, under many names, but the pattern is remarkably consistent. Someone receives it as a gift, finds it in an attic, purchases it in a second-hand shop, or inherits it from a relative whose life was already marked by loneliness or grief. At first, the object seems ordinary. Then small disturbances begin. A chair is found turned toward the wall. The doll appears in another room. A family pet refuses to go near it. Children insist it speaks when no one is there. Adults dismiss these claims until the atmosphere of the home itself begins to change. Photographs are taken, priests are consulted. Paranormal investigators arrive with equipment designed to make the unseen measurable. Yet what they usually capture is not proof, only escalation. A growing web of testimony, fear, and suggestion that binds everyone near the object into the same narrative. The doll becomes less a toy than a stage on which private anxieties take visible form. That may be why these stories endure so powerfully in the modern age. Dolls are made in our image, but simplified. They resemble us without carrying the unpredictability of real life. They are companions designed to absorb projection, love, comfort, loneliness, neglect. All of it can be poured into them. And when that emotional charge turns dark, the doll seems to answer not because it has changed, but because we have. So perhaps the haunting of the doll says less about spirits than about intimacy, about how easily the human mind animates what looks back at it, about how grief, fear, and memory seek bodies, even artificial ones, in which to settle. A doll cannot suffer, it cannot scheme, it cannot choose. But in the quiet theater of the home, where private pain often goes unnamed, it can become a vessel for everything a family has not yet learned how to say aloud. And sometimes that is haunting enough. What if the final mystery was not hidden inside any single artifact, but in the pattern that joins them all? By now, the objects begin to speak to one another. A cheap print spared by fire, a locked box heavy with inherited dread, a violet stone carried from a temple into empire, fragments mailed back to the desert, a funerary mask, a fatal chair, a coffin lid, a famous diamond, a sacred mirror, a stolen skull, a doll that gathered more fear than fabric should hold. They come from different centuries, different belief systems, different landscapes of grief and reverence, and yet they seem to circle the same human truth. Again and again, the unease begins at the moment of separation. An object is removed from ritual, from burial, from sacred ground, from the intimacy of family life, from the world that once gave it purpose. Then it enters another system entirely. The marketplace, the museum, the private collection, the tabloid headline, the internet auction, the suburban home. We call that transfer preservation, discovery, ownership, even admiration. But beneath those words lies a quieter possibility, that some things are altered not only physically when displaced, but morally. That context is not decoration. It is part of the object itself. This does not mean every curse story is true in a literal sense. Most likely are not. Coincidence remains powerful. So does rumor, so does the mind's gift for pattern making, especially when fear lights the edges of ordinary life. But dismissing all of these stories too quickly may cause us to miss what they are really preserving. Not proof of the supernatural, but evidence of a lasting intuition that matter can carry meaning, and that meaning can be violated. Perhaps that is why cursed artifacts remain so compelling in a scientific age. They remind us that explanation is not the same as understanding. We may know what a pigment is made of, how a gemstone refracts light, how wood ages, how social contagion spreads through rumor and expectation. Yet none of that fully answers the deeper ache these stories awaken. What do we owe the past when it reaches us in material form? What responsibilities come with touching what once belonged to the dead, the sacred, the conquered, the grieving? And how many of our so-called hauntings are really the sound of history asking not to be handled so carelessly? The final chapter may not belong to the objects at all. It may belong to us and to the way we choose to remember what was never truly ours to take. In the end, perhaps the word cursed has always been too narrow. It suggests punishment descending from somewhere beyond us, a force acting on innocent lives for reasons no one can see. But the stories we have followed point toward something more human, and therefore, in its own way, more profound. Again and again, the objects at the center of these legends became unsettling only after they were removed, traded, displayed, possessed, or misunderstood. Their mystery did not begin in isolation. It began in relationship and in the breaking of it. That may be the thread that binds everything together. Not supernatural vengeance, but the after-image of disturbance, a sacred item severed from ritual, a grave good lifted into commerce, a stone carried away from land that held it in meaning long before it held value, a familiar household object transformed by grief, fear, or the stories people needed in order to live beside what they could not explain. These are not merely tales about haunted things. They are tales about memory under pressure. And memory is never passive. It lives in archives and songs, in family warnings and museum labels, in the uneasy silence that sometimes enters a room when history is present but unnamed. Objects become powerful because people do. We love through them. We mourn through them. We conquer through them. We display our longing, our guilt, our reverence, and our blindness through them. Over time, the object begins to look as though it is acting on us, when sometimes it is simply holding still long enough for us to feel what we brought into its presence. That does not make these stories trivial. If anything, it makes them more important. Because once we stop asking whether an artifact is literally cursed, we can begin asking better questions. What histories were buried inside it? Who lost the right to decide where it belongs? What forms of knowledge were dismissed because they did not sound like science, even when they carried a deep understanding of balance, place, and care? Maybe that is the final lesson, not that the world is ruled by hidden malice, but that meaning has weight. Places have integrity. The dead are owed dignity. The sacred is not always visible to the eye trained only to evaluate and possess. And when we forget those things, the consequences may arrive not as thunder or spectacle, but as unease, repetition, accident, sorrow, and the persistent feeling that something has not been honored. So the question we are left with is not whether these artifacts were ever truly cursed. It is whether we have learned to listen when history asks to be touched with humility, because the future will inherit objects from us as well. And one day, someone else will decide what our belongings mean, what they reveal, and what should have been left undisturbed. When that moment comes, perhaps the deepest hope is this, that we will be remembered not only for what we discovered, but for what we finally learned to respect.